Hey there, guys. So it's been a little while. I promise I'll kind of go over everything that's really happened in like the last 2 years and state of the channel, future of the channel, all of that stuff in my next video. I think hopefully sometime next week. But for now, I saw Elemental a little while ago, and between the movie and kind of everything surrounding the movie, there's a lot of stuff that I've been wanting to talk about. So I figured, who better to talk to about all of it than with you guys? So first things first, when it comes to the movie, I actually really enjoyed it. I still think that original Pixar is best Pixar, and much more on that later in the video. But no, it's funny because it's hard to gauge sometimes in today's space how people are feeling about a movie. Everyone is very, I guess, strongly opinionated one way or the other, and especially on Twitter sometimes, especially with how Twitter is now, where you don't necessarily see all the people you're following, it can be hard to kind of get a feel for how people are feeling about the movie. But I've seen some positive, seen some negative. Me personally, I actually really liked Elemental. And again, as always, kind of a spoilerish warning. I won't get like too much into the movie, but I am going to get into some details of the movie. So if you haven't seen it yet in theaters, hang tight, either pause the video here and come back to it after you watched it, or I'll probably have some timestamps and things in the timeline where if you just want to hear about like the discourse surrounding Elemental and Pixar in general, I'll let you know what spot to pop back in if you don't want anything spoiled for you yet. So yeah, Elemental is really one of Pixar's first true rom-coms, and I was trying to think as I was going through this if even like Disney animation in general has had something that can be conceived of as like a rom-com. They definitely have had a lot of movies that have involved romance and comedy, and there have been elements of rom-coms, but in terms of like a true genre-specific rom-com, I really don't know that they've had one. I'm sure I'm probably forgetting something somewhere, and I'm sure you guys will let me know if I have, but certainly for Pixar, it really is one of the first like rom-com movies that I can remember, and the formula actually works really well here, though it's not just like a stereotypical rom-com. I think it's a little deeper and has more layers than just, a cookie cutter romantic comedy. And what I mean by more depth is that there was a lot more themes at play here than just like guy meets girl, opposites attract, all those things we typically see in rom-coms. This movie is a lot talking about kind of second generational pressures and trauma, dealing, the daughter, in this case, Ember, of immigrants. It talks about class issues. Because there's really a class difference between Ember and Wade, and they don't dig too deep into it, but it is there. The struggles that immigrants go through, especially first and second generation immigrants go through, and kind of dealing with that in a city that may not always be built for them, which was interesting. And again, stuff like that adds more layers to this movie, and I think helps it speak to more people than if it was just a typical rom-com. I think that Peter San, who directed this, was a very he wrote it and directed it, and you can tell that he has some experience with this lifestyle, as he does, being the son of, I believe, Korean immigrants. So certainly some stuff he was pulling from real life, and I think that aided the movie in general. And I think what's super important with rom-coms and making them work is especially your main characters and the chemistry between those main characters. And I do think that Elemental has that. I really liked the characters, Ember and Wade. I liked how they played off each other. I saw some people who were commenting that there wasn't really chemistry between the two characters. I disagree with that. I think it felt natural. It didn't feel super forced throughout. And I think a lot of that has to do with the portrayal of Ember and Wade. It was interesting to me, especially in today's landscape for animated movies, that the two leads and really the entire voice cast in general, there's no stereotypical A-list actors. Ember is voiced by, I have my notes here, Leah Lewis. Wade Ripple was voiced by, oh boy, Mahmoudou Athie. I hope I said that correctly. They both did a very good job with the characters, again, made them feel alive. And again, they had that chemistry between the two that is so important in making a movie like this work. And yeah, it's interesting that they didn't use A-list actors, but I actually think that it made the movie better because they weren't just trying to shoehorn a name in order to sell the movie. They were trying to get the right people who can portray the right emotions and the right characterization. So ultimately, I actually think it was a good decision to stay away from stereotypical A-list actors in this case. There also was a lot of discussion about father figures and their children in this movie, because in a number of different instances, obviously one of the main conflicts or just relationships that we're really examining is Ember and her father who is an immigrant and has built this life up really from the ground up, as we find out, and is planning on giving his store, and then we believe that's his dream, is this store, to have Ember one day take it over. So obviously there's a lot of dynamics of that relationship about Ember feeling like she's a bad daughter because she may not necessarily want this dream, or trying to live up to her father's sacrifice. And again, a lot of these pressures that second generation immigrants feel. But even sprinkled throughout the movie, you see kind of this specifically paternal relationship that keeps coming up again and again. Gail, who is Wade's boss and really the head of the city, we see that she's a big Windbreakers fan. That wind ball is a sport there, and of course Windbreakers, always a good pun there. But the reason why she's such a big fan of the team is because her and her father used to go to the games when she was little. Wade was close to his father who passed away, and he feels like there were some issues there that he wishes he could have solved before he passed away. So specifically, these relationships with the father keep getting examined. I don't know that they were fully examined aside from the initial one with Ember and her father. Maybe we could have explored some of those more to really kind of drive that theme home. But I just thought it was interesting that particular relationship, father and son or daughter, was really looked at and examined over and over again in different aspects. I also thought the music in this movie was great. The composer was Thomas Newman, who's done a bunch of Pixar movies in the past. And aside from just your typical score, for a Pixar movie, scoring the action or the romantic scenes, there was a lot of like ethnic tones in the movie. So the fire people, basically Ember and her family, are meant to be, I kind of got a lot of like Middle Eastern, apparently there's some like North African, kind of an amalgamation of a bunch of different immigrant experiences, but especially that Middle Eastern influence you really saw in the score, and I thought it added a little extra flavor to things, and especially whenever there's action involving Ember, like when she was racing through to try to beat her father's delivery record, or when they were running away from the flood, that little kind of extra flavor of Middle Eastern instruments and instrumentation, I thought went a long way into really kind of helping you get into this world. And then there's one song in the movie that appears in the middle and in the credits as well. It was Steal the Show by Lauv. I actually think that was also a very good choice of a song. It was written for the movie, but again, it really helps encapsulate kind of the other part of the movie. So whereas the score was really kind of giving you the world and again that taste of like ethnicity, the song really helps kind of round out the love story and really kind of encompasses those themes of falling in love and really kind of get you into a rom-com-ish mood. Sometimes when you have a song and a non-musical, it can kind of take you out of it. I thought this song helped kind of get you more into the story and especially the relationship between Ember and Wade. But yeah, I mean, again, overall, I thought it was just a feel-good movie. It was funny. It was a movie that I didn't know a ton about going in. And again, I think we'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. But sometimes you can be pleasantly surprised, I think, when you don't feel like you know the entire plot going in. Like the whole aspect of Ember and her family being immigrants, I didn't know any of that going into this movie. I really only kind of knew fire, water, element, city, like those elements, no pun intended, of the movie. So, I was pleasantly surprised. And again, it's not, hearing kind of mixed things going in, sometimes your expectations are sort of mid-level. So when you end up, seeing a movie that you really enjoy and it really kind of over delivers. And it's interesting because, we keep talking about one of the main aspects of this movie is talking about generational trauma or kind of second generation living up to the expectations of the parent. And that was also a very heavy theme in Turning Red, which was a relatively recent release for Pixar. So I see a lot of comparisons between the two, and I've seen that as a knock on Elemental. People feel that Turning Red did that better. And it's hard for me to say. I enjoyed both. I never like when you have to compare the movies, but here we are. I did like both, and I liked how both handled that issue. I think they were handled slightly differently, partially because the actual ethnicities were different, the expectations were slightly different from one to the other, and even a little thing of dealing with the father instead of dealing with the mother like they did in Turning Red. There's enough variance in there. It is strange that like this particular aspect has been honed in on in not back-to-back movies, but very close to back-to-back movies. But even still, I do think that there's enough difference in the two that it's something that I thought about during the movie, but not something that kind of took away from my enjoyment of Elemental, if that makes sense. But yeah, aside from the movie itself, a lot of what has interested me about Elemental has been a lot of the discourse, a lot of the talk kind of surrounding Elemental, because it really has been interesting and in a lot of ways indicative of the film industry as a whole and Disney Pixar as a whole. So I kind of wanted to dig into that because some of that has been almost more interesting than the movie. Not a knock on the movie in any way, more of a kind of how my brain works when it comes to movies and the film industry. So the box office journey of Elemental has been really a roller coaster and has been kind of fascinating to watch because the opening weekend was very publicly and very notoriously a disaster. It was the second lowest opening for a Pixar movie ever. And the lowest opening ever was actually Toy Story, the original one back in 1995, I think it was. So one, that shows you just kind of how strong Pixar has been and how tough this opening was, especially when you figure that low number for Toy Story, one, was because it was the first ever Pixar movie, but two, partially because of inflation. If you adjust for inflation, it did okay and sold considerably more tickets than Elemental did. So in some respects, Elemental had the worst opening for a Pixar movie ever. An inauspicious start for sure. But that being said, the movie has actually kind of bounced back in subsequent weeks. So it has still dropped, from week to week, as most movies do, but the drops have not been as significant as you usually see in a movie like this. And actually, a recent report has came out that the movie is actually trending decently. I think it broke the 200 million mark worldwide. So while it may not entirely get back to even or make money domestically, it looks like it's not going to be a financial disaster. And it does show that word of mouth still has a place in this world, because usually if a movie struggles the first weekend, it's just written off as a flop, it's a box office disaster, and it's dead. But that's not what happened here, because it did come back. So that's usually indicative that the people who did see the movie liked it enough to talk about it, and then more people saw it. It's also indicative that a lot was going on in that opening weekend, and a lot of that, I think, has to do with what happened to this movie in the opening weekend, because we're talking about things like competition, the state of the movie industry, the state of Pixar, and all of that, which all kind of blends together, really can help paint a picture for why Elemental, which was not a bad movie, struggled so much in its opening weekend. So there's an interview that came out recently from Pete Docter, who's basically the head guy at Pixar these days. And he was talking about a lot of things that I was just mentioning as kind of an explanation for why Elemental struggled so much early, talking about, again, the state of the film industry, about, the state of Pixar and the comparisons that new Pixar gets compared to old Pixar, Disney Plus and how that's affected things. And I do think, while some people could certainly see that as like, well, these are just convenient excuses, one, I do think that they do explain a little bit of what went on. And two, again, that steady bounce back that the movie had in subsequent weeks, I do think leads some credence to what Doctor was saying as for like legitimate reasons why this movie struggled so much early. So yeah, digging deeper into those reasons, I keep kind of teasing them, but I guess we'll look at them further now. Pixar's been in kind of a weird stretch recently, because after kind of a long stretch of doing sequels and movies based on existing properties, they made a concerted effort to put out original movies. And this is really, it's the longest stretch that Pixar has had since their initial run of original movies. I think it's 5 of the last 6, depending on how you want to count Lightyear, and 6 of the last 8. I think, of the movies that they've released were completely original movies. And compare that to when Pixar was first putting out movies, 9 of their first 10 were original movies. But what's weird about this stretch where they've been releasing original movies is that those movies are coming out, unfortunately, in a time that is terrible for the film industry because of COVID and everything that went on for really a 2.5-year period there. And Pixar in particular has really felt the brunt of that. So I have my notes here, just kind of like looking at them. I mean, when you look at the movies that have come out recently for Pixar, you had Onward, which was pulled early. That came out right when the pandemic hit. It was in theaters for a little bit. It was doing well in the theaters, and then the world shut down, so that kind of got the plug pulled quick. They had Soul come out, which was released directly to Disney Plus because that was during the pandemic. Luca released directly to Disney Plus. That was during the pandemic. Turning Red, which was supposed to come out in theaters, and the Omicron variant came out, shut everything down, was put directly on Disney Plus because of COVID. Lightyear, which did make it to theaters, that had its own kind of collection of issues behind it, but it was in theaters for 2 months before making its debut on Disney Plus. So there's a couple of things at play here. One, just over and over again, Pixar movies in particular have been able to be consumed at home. 2, when you have a movie like Lightyear, which was only out for a couple months before showing up on Disney Plus, it is teaching your audience that you can wait a little bit and the movie will be at home at the subscription that you already pay for. And when you look at the price of movies and how much can a family go to the theater, is it more fiscally responsible to wait a month or two to watch it at home as opposed to going to the theater to watch it, especially when you know it's going to be there in a month or two? I think that these are factors towards why people would not go to the theater to see Elemental. And then when you consider the competition that it was facing just in the run-up to the release of Elemental, you had particularly Little Mermaid and Into the Spider-Verse, or Across the Spider-Verse, rather, which were family-oriented, geared towards families. Those came out within a month of Elemental. That's not counting all the other movies that had come out before it, especially something like Super Mario. How many times can you reasonably expect a family to go to the movies within a 1 month, 2 month span? Again, especially if they can make that decision to just wait. If you had to pick one of 2 movies to see, if you had to pick between Spider-Man or Elemental. Spider-Man, you don't know when it's going to come out video on demand. Elemental, history tells you it's probably going to come out sooner rather than later. Now, I don't know that that's necessarily going to be the case. Disney looks like they are trying to stretch theatrical releases for both Elemental and eventually Wish. I've heard that Elemental is supposed to be in the theaters until Labor Day. So that may not be true necessarily with this movie. But again, you have 2.5 years of evidence that people are basing this off of. And I think that can be a huge decision maker and a huge factor into why people might not go to see this movie immediately in the theaters. And then you also have to look at how this movie is being compared to previous movies. We did that a little bit just with Turning Red, and that's just within movies that were released close to each other in the same era. That's typically what, that'll happen. Pixar is in a weird place because their initial movies were so good. Again, we talked about before that this has been a stretch of really almost all original movies, aside from Lightyear, in a stretch which mirrors what they did when they first came out with all of these original movies back to back to back, 9 out of 10 to open Pixar's film run, with the 10th being Toy Story 2, which was also very good. Of those 9 movies, we're talking about some of the greatest movies in Pixar's library. We're talking about movies like Toy Story, Finding Nemo, Up, and these movies that not only WALL-E, that were not only financially, very strong, but critically are acclaimed of some of the great, not just animated movies, but movies in general. We're talking about movies that were nominated for Best Picture. So that is what Pixar's history is. And when people think Pixar animation, they think about the opening 10 minutes from Up. They think about these emotional movies and these, genre-changing, genre-defining movies. it's hard to do that over and over again. And I do think that movies like Elemental sometimes are looked down upon because they are not what Pixar had in the earlier, because it's not Finding Nemo, it's not Toy Story or Monsters Inc. And again, there's a double-edged sword with that, because on the one hand, no, I don't think Elemental is as good as, some of your all-time classic movies, but they're all-time classic movies. Just because a movie is not as good or as historically relevant as, one of the greatest animated movies of all time doesn't mean it's a bad movie. And I think sometimes Pixar movies can be judged unnecessarily harshly because of that, because people go in expecting, this emotional roller coaster. So if you just get that was good movie, people view that as bad or as a negative. And I saw that kind of in a lot of the reviews, or a lot of the negative reviews for this movie was, it's not Finding Nemo. In fairness, Finding Dory wasn't Finding Nemo either. Like it's hard to reach those highs. Pixar has done it in subsequent years after that initial run. You look at movies like Toy Story 3 or Coco. There have been movies that I think have reached those levels, but they're few and far between. They're hard to do. And I think that a lot of this run of original movies has kind of been knocked on, partially because they're being compared to these older movies, but also partially because of the nature of people are watching them at home. When you look at movies like Luca, which I really liked, Soul, which I thought was a great movie, like a very deep movie. These are films I think would be looked at and judged and remembered very differently if they had these theatrical runs, as opposed to what happened to them where they were released on Disney Plus because, they wanted to put these out. They didn't want to have to just go on ice for all this time. And I think that weirdly has hurt Pixar in a way. Yes, these movies have come out, but I think that sometimes the mystique of them can be tarnished a bit. And where my concern with all of this is, and kind of where I'm going with all this and why it's so interesting to me is, I don't want people to kind of conflate, well, Pixar has put out a bunch of original movies and Pixar has had issues, financially, or these movies haven't been as strong, so therefore original Pixar is not as good and they should lean more on sequels. I'm hoping that's not where this conversation ends up going. And part of where my concern of that comes in is just the nature of movies in general right now. When you look at, I have the domestic box office for this year, the top movies. When you look at the top 20, almost all of them are existing properties or sequels. You have Super Mario Brothers, which is an existing property. Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, which is a sequel. Guardians Volume 3, which is a sequel. Little Mermaid, existing property. Avatar, sequel. Ant-Man and the Wasp, sequel. John Wick Chapter 4, sequel. Creed 3, sequel. Transformers, sequel. Fast X, sequel. Puss in Boots, sequel. Indiana Jones, sequel. Then Elemental. Scream 6, sequel, and The Flash, existing property. Those are the top 15 movies domestically in the box office in 2023. One of them is an original film, and ironically it's Elemental, which has been viewed as not a financial success. And this is not a new phenomenon either. Ironically, one of the last videos that I had put out was talking about sequelitis. I'll leave a link for that somewhere in the description. But when I had put that out, I had pulled the numbers from 2019, which was really the last year of kind of relevant box office stats before the pandemic and the theater industry in general got all kind of scrambled. And in that year, I think it was 16 of the top 20 movies, not counting Joker, which could conceivably make it like 17 of the top 20 movies, were existing properties or sequels. So again, this is not a new phenomenon, and it's not news to anyone that sequels are what is making money right now. And again, much like I said in that video, I understand, how business works. I understand how industries work, and I understand that sequels are important to that, and sequels make the most money. We keep seeing data points that show that over and over again. And this is not to say that a Pixar sequel can't be good. Obviously, we've seen Pixar sequels can be very good. You look at Monsters University, which I thought was very good. Toy Story 3, arguably the best Pixar movie of all time, depending on who you talk to. But for my taste, I always have preferred the original Pixar movies. Again, ironically, in that video, I talk about how excited I was for this stretch of original Pixar movies. And again, I do think that they have, for the most part, delivered. They've been good movies. It's just they're not being elevated to that level because critically they haven't been elevated to that level, and financially because, one, they're not sequels, and two, they just haven't been in theaters because of the state of the world. They are viewed as less than, and I really hope that this is not a trend that Pixar kind of gets away from. I hope that they continue, and Disney animation, I hope that they continue to try to make, original movies and not sequels. The other part about this, and this has been kind of a discussion point with Disney in general, and particularly Disney animation, is they do have to start advertising these movies a little bit. I actually thought that Elemental's advertisement was decent. I say that with an asterisk. We're going to keep that in mind because I'm going to address that a little bit. But I thought it was decent. Part of why I thought it was decent was because I at least knew the movie was coming out. I knew when it was coming out, and I knew the basics of it. I didn't feel like we were getting overloaded by ads. I didn't feel like Disney was going full court blitz on it. But at least, there was the knowledge it was there. Could it have been more? Yeah. And I look at a movie like Barbie, which is coming out, and the advertising that they've done. Social media, they've been everywhere. They've been teaming up with various corporations, and so they're in more commercials than usual. Obviously, just the commercials, the buzz, the word of mouth. There is nowhere you can go without seeing advertisements for Barbie. Everybody and their brother knows when Barbie is coming out into theaters. To an extent, Oppenheimer's been very similar, and some of that's been just kind of tagging along with the Barbie advertisements. But I look at how these movies have been advertised, and then I look at how Elemental has been advertised, and there's definitely, it's a canyon of difference between the two. That being said, I think part of why I thought Elemental was okay was because I was comparing it to the last Disney property, or Disney animation property that came out, and that was Strange World, which had almost no advertising. And again, we can get into the minutia and the political reasons why these things might be happening or not happening, but point remains, if you're not going to tell someone that a movie is coming out, it's going to be hard for them to go to the theater, and that's especially true with original properties. Sequels tend to sell themselves because you are reaching out to people who saw and enjoyed the first movie. John Wick 4 didn't have to advertise itself very much because you had the people who enjoyed John Wick, John Wick 2, John Wick 3. They know what the movie is, they know what they're expecting, they know the story, they're already emotionally invested with the characters. Even Barbie, to a point, despite all of the advertising that they've done, there was a level of that, fan base of people who, Barbie, that are just going to see it anyway. Disney and Pixar have that to a point. I do think that they have people where they're always going to see the Disney movie, they're always going to see the Pixar movie. But as Strange World, especially in Elemental to a point, has showed us, especially for original properties, you really, really have to push those and let people know they're coming and get people excited to see them in theaters. The theater industry is starting to bounce back this year, and I think that Disney and Pixar have to really start, treating it differently than how it was before the pandemic, really trying to grab viewers and bring them into the theater to see their movies. I think that Wish is going to be a big barometer of this. It's the next Disney animated film that's coming out. I'm excited for it. I just saw the trailer for it, and I thought it looked very good. I think this is supposed to be a big movie for Disney. I'm very curious to see how their advertisement goes for this movie compared to how it has been in the last, really, 2 or 3 years. Some of this might be because they haven't really had to advertise movies as much because they were just going on Disney Plus. But again, theater industry is back, so you have to start motivating people to go see these movies in theaters because that's what they're meant to be seen. It's where you get the most experience out of it, in my opinion, at least. Don't get me wrong. I understand I'm a dinosaur when it comes to these things. I like going to the movie theater. I like experiencing my movies in a theater setting and without distractions and things like that. But if box office numbers are ultimately what is going to decide if a movie is successful or not, or good or not. You can even see that just in the in the reviews for Elemental. When you look at the reviews, look at the date the review came out, because I found that reviews in the initial week when the movie was trending downward in terms of financials, they weren't as good. And then the reviews I saw that came out later were better as the movie started to bounce back. So I think that sometimes, people get in their heads these financial numbers. So if that's what you're up against, if you're Disney and Pixar, then you got to find a way to get people into the theater, and advertising is a good way to do that. The last thing I'll say before I get going is there was a short before Elemental, and that was Carl's Date, Carl from Up. So I thought it was a very good short. It's funny, my opinion with Pixar shorts and Disney shorts is similar to my movie takes, but a little bit different. While I still believe that the original ones are the best ones, and they're really the best breeding ground for new animation and exciting visuals and things like that, I do think that these shorts are a good home for these properties that already exist that we still want to just kind of be around. No one is clamoring for an Up 2. At least I don't think they are. I don't think that would be a good idea. But these shorts that they've done with Carl and Doug, I think is a nice way to kind of keep checking in on these characters and keep getting a taste of these worlds and these movies without having to go with a full-blown movie. And Carl's Date I thought really encompassed that, because it had the humor with Doug that we remember from Up. There's a lot of shorts. I think Doug Days is what they're called, that really kind of follow these two. So it still has that humor, but the premise of the short is that Carl gets asked out on a date, and of course it'll be his first date since Ellie. So you kind of always know that emotional hook is sitting in the back, and eventually they do get that payoff, and I think it was very well earned and it was well executed, and it really did kind of give you all the flavors of the movie Up, but just in a condensed 5-6 minute short. Yeah, I thought it was really enjoyable. A nice kind of pairing with Elemental, which goes on to be kind of like a rom-com and looking at romance, and I thought that it was kind of an interesting pairing, but appropriate. And yeah, again, Pixar shorts are always so good, but I really enjoyed this one. But yeah, that about does it for my thoughts on Elemental and kind of everything surrounding it. So let me know if you've seen the movie, or if you have thoughts about Pixar and the box office and the movie industry and all those good things. Let me know what your thoughts for all of those things are in the comments below. Again, thank you guys for watching and for kind of sticking around after all this time and letting me ramble a little bit. It was nice to be able to talk in front of a camera again. Like I said, I think maybe sometime next week I'll be making another video just kind of addressing kind of where I've been all this time and what's been going on, state of the channel, future of the channel, all that good stuff. But for now, I think I'm going to take my leave and say goodbye for you guys. Say goodbye to you guys, rather. So let me know your thoughts on Elemental down below, and I'll see you all real soon.